Irish.
Γεια σας, ακούτε, για όσους δεν με ξέρετε, ονομάζομαι Dan-Ell και διευθύνω το Τμήμα Ελληνικών Σπουδών του Πανεπιστημίου της Νέας Υόρκης και το καλοκαιρινό πρόγραμμα στην Αθήνα, το οποίο θα αρχίσει σε λίγες μέρες. Εδώ που βρισκόμαστε είναι το καινούργιο ερευνητικό κέντρο του NYU, και θα τα έχω πει προηγουμένως, αλλά για όσους δεν ξέρετε, το οποίο φέρνει καθηγητές και μεταπτυχιακούς φοιτητές από την Αμερική για να κάνουν έρευνα σε σχέση με την Ελλάδα. Και στο πλαίσιο αυτού του ερευνητικού κέντρου θέλουμε να κάνουμε και μια σειρά ομιλιών και εκδηλώσεων για να φέρει σε μεγαλύτερη επαφή την Αμερική με την Ελλάδα. Μία από αυτές τις εκδηλώσεις και τις ομιλίες είναι η ομιλία του κυρίου Dan-el Padilla Peralta, ο οποίος είναι καθηγητής κλασικών σπουδών στο Πανεπιστήμιο Princeton. Είναι μεγάλη μας τιμή και χαρά που είναι μαζί μας σήμερα. Θα σας πω δύο λόγια για αυτόν και μετά θα προχωρήσουμε. Ο κύριος Padilla Peralta γεννήθηκε στη Δομινικανή Δημοκρατία και από εκεί βρέθηκε ως μετανάστης χωρίς χαρτιά και άστεγος στη Νέα Υόρκη, στις βιβλιοθήκες της οποίας ανακάλυψε τους αρχαίους Έλληνες και Λατίνους συγγραφείς, οι οποίοι τον ενέπνευσαν και κατέληξε καθηγητής κλασικών σπουδών στο Princeton. Πριν φτάσει εκεί, έκανε τις προπτυχιακές του σπουδές στο Princeton, κάποιος εθελοντής στη βιβλιοθήκη τον ανακάλυψε και του είπε να κάνει υποτροφία, να κάνει έτσι υποτροφία, πήρε υποτροφία, βρέθηκε στο Princeton, τελείωσε το 2006. Ήταν και αυτό που λένε στο Princeton Auditorium, δηλαδή έδωσε την ομιλία, τον λόγο που βγάζουν οι φοιτητές όταν αποφοιτούν, ο πρώτος και ο δεύτερος φοιτητής, ο πρώτος και ο καλύτερος φοιτητής δίνει τις ομιλίες. Είναι δεύτερος στη χρονιά του και μάλιστα τον έδωσε τον λόγο του στα λατινικά. Από εκεί έκανε με μάστερ σε φιλοσοφία στην Οξφόρδη, διδακτορικό στο Stanford, 2 χρόνια μεταδιδακτορικά στο Κολάμπια και από εκεί καθηγητής κλασικών σπουδών στο Princeton. Τις εμπειρίες του αυτές από τα παιδικά χρόνια μέχρι το Princeton τις κατέγραψε στο αυτογραφικό του βιβλίο, το memoir δηλαδή, αυτό εδώ, εντάξει, το οποίο λέγεται Undocumented, χωρίς χαρτιά, A Dominican Boy's Odyssey from a Homeless Shelter to the Ivy League, το οποίο έχει γίνει bestseller στην Αμερική και για το Penguin και ελπίζω να βγει στην Ελλάδα στα ελληνικά. Λόγω αυτού προφανώς έχει συμμετάσχει σε χιλιάδες κουβέντες για τη μεταναστευτική πολιτική των ΗΠΑ και γενικότερα. Τα ερευνητικά του ενδιαφέροντα εστιάζονται στη Ρωμαϊκή Αυτοκρατορία. 2 βιβλία του πρόκειται να βγουν, ένα από το Princeton και το άλλο Πανεπιστημιακές Εκδόσεις Καλιφόρνια. Το ένα λέγεται Divine Institutions για τη Ρωμαϊκή Αυτοκρατορία και το δεύτερο λέγεται Empire of Plunder. Μ' αρέσει πολύ αυτό. Γενικά προφανώς το ενδιαφέρον είναι πολλά σε σχέση με την Ρωμαϊκή Αυτοκρατορία, αλλά εστιάζει το ενδιαφέρον του στην έννοια της ηθαγένειας. Και μαζί με την έννοια της ηθαγένειας πάει και το άλλο το ενδιαφέρον, το οποίο έχει σχέση με την ομιλία που θα δώσει σήμερα, που έχει να κάνει με τα απορρίμματα. Εντάξει, δηλαδή, πώς το λέω, τα απόβλητα. Δηλαδή, το ρόλο των αποβλήτων και απορριμμάτων στις αρχαίες και στις σύγχρονες κοινωνίες, από την αρχαιότητα μέχρι σήμερα δηλαδή, πώς χρησιμοποιούνται τα απόβλητα σε όλες αυτές τις κοινωνίες και κυρίως πώς τα απόβλητα χρησιμοποιούνται για να αποκλείσουν κάποιους ανθρώπους. Δηλαδή πώς ανατρέχουμε στον όρο απόβλητα για να κατηγοροποιήσουμε κάποιους ανθρώπους. Και κατασκευάζουμε τον άλλο, λέει, όταν θέλουμε, ονομάζοντάς τον απόβλητο ή απόρριμα. Όπως θεωρεί ότι η μεταναστευτική πολιτική, τον είπα αυτή τη στιγμή, έχει κατασκευάσει όλους τους μετανάστες, τους ονομάζει τους μετανάστες βάρος. Εντάξει, περιττό βάρος, απόβλητο. Μέσα σε αυτό το ενδιαφέρον του είναι και η σημερινή του ομιλία, η οποία έχει τον τίτλο, όπως είδατε, Coping with Waste, τον υπέροχο ελληνικό τίτλο Copropolitics, from Aristophanes to Paul McCarthy. Εντάξει, προφανώς το Copropolitics, οι Έλληνες το πιάσαμε, αν και όχι αναγκαστικά. Πολύ χάρη το Copropolitics, λέω δεν τώρα να βάλετε το τίτλο στην Ελλάδα, να το δώσω. Αλλά είναι ιδιαίτερος ενδιαφέρον ο τίτλος. Μετά την ομιλία θα έχει συζήτηση και προφανώς όπως συνήθως θα ανέβω μετά επάνω στην ταράτσα για ένα ποτήρι κρασί. Εάν θέλετε ή αισθάνεστε ότι δεν μπορείτε να μιλήσετε στα αγγλικά, παρόλο που καταλαβαίνετε, είμαι σίγουρη, πείτε τις ερωτήσεις στα ελληνικά και τις μεταφράσουμε, δεν υπάρχει θέμα. Εντάξει, ας καλωσορίσουμε τον κύριο Padilla Peralta που θα μιλήσουμε στο τέλος.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here tonight, and I have to start. I'm getting the cue to speak louder. Yes. Can everyone hear me? Yay! All right. So I have to start with expressions of gratitude. First of all, to the NYU program in Athens and to Leanna for the wonderful invitation and the opportunity to spend time with all of you tonight. To you, who will be my captive audience for the next 45 minutes or so. But I also am in the debt of several scholars whom I'll name over the course of the evening who have really gotten me to think more carefully and critically about waste, about excrement. And this project emerges in large part as a reflection on how we use waste to think and how we use waste to order social relations, to categorize and classify different subjects in our communities, but fundamentally how we use waste to constitute ourselves and our selfhood. I take my cue from Jacques Lacan's lectures on anxiety and his insistence that, to quote him, it's a matter of explaining the function in the constitution of anal desire of a certain object that is, if you will, the turd, to call a spade a spade. Lacan's attention to the turd in the horizons of the subconscious springs from Freud's celebrated postulation of the anal phase, as many people know, the second developmental juncture in a child's formation, in which the assertion over control over bladder and bowel movements lines up with an awareness of where to make those bladder and bowel movements to mark the attainment of a species of self-control. In fixating on the control of voiding, the child, according to this reasoning, gains a new mastery over herself, but it's not without costs. I'm interested in some of those costs. Foundational to this performance of control, and here Lacan has plenty more to say, is the identification of the expelled object as not I. Mommy, I made a poop. The refinement of self-control thus rides in the company of a more ominously deployable psychological mechanism, and that is the capacity to make and name the other that is not you, the other that has come out of your body but is no longer a part of it. So in very rough terms, the child's generation and designation of waste acts as a relational device. It's a means of manufacturing order. The internalization of the socially dictated rules and conventions for depositing waste marks a transformative leap forward in the child's ability to appreciate the matrix of power and responsibility, and this is something that will be well known to all of you who have potty-trained children. For this reason, the reverberations of the anal phase radiate well beyond the sphere of psychoanalysis. And so one of the proposals I want to evaluate is whether we have a responsibility to theorize fecality and excrementality as principles of the civic order, under the rubric of what I will call Copropolitics, which is the subtitle. If Piero Manzoni's notorious Merda de Artista cans did not make the case persuasively enough, one recent installation at the Guggenheim has reactivated questions about the valence and signification of the fecal in the realm of the aesthetic. Is it just play? Is it calculated satire? Is it transgression for transgression's sake? And far from being restricted to the precincts of art, Chit, as artifact, has enjoyed a distinguished career in political satire, as many people know, and here we might summon to the witness stand the street artist Hank C's mural on Orchard Street in New York City. Not despite, but because of its repulsiveness, the excremental has a power to signify that is equaled by only a few other liquids and solids. So it'll be the purpose of tonight's paper to argue first that the signifying potency of shit justifies a disciplinary program of its very own, a fecal-poetics and a copropolitics. But the second branch of the argument is that this disciplinary program should be housed and incubated within the field of classics. The felicitous prospects of such an affiliation with classics seem to be most resplendently on display in Paul McCarthy's drawings for the Plato in LA exhibit at the Getty Villa in Los Angeles. And here you see the drawing, which you can digest for a moment. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, a special kind of relationship. So what might it mean to think with this drawing as a stepping stone to a new model of relationality? Before McCarthy, though, there is the self that is behind this posture of the copropolitical. And to establish the premises and parameters of my argument, I find it necessary to say something about my own situatedness in relation to excrement. Never an easy thing. Reared in the best of Catholic traditions, I internalize Augustine of Hippo's aphorism, between shit and urine we are born, early on. But if the path to psychoanalysis begins not with the church, but with one's parents, then perhaps the spur to my escalating identification with the fecal has a very specific origin in a memory. And it is a memory that is not mine, but of my mother. As my mother was growing up in the Caribbean, in the northern Dominican Republic, she fell into a communal cesspit one afternoon and almost drowned as a toddler. Brought back from the brink of asphyxiation, she came down with a life-threatening infection that was contracted from the waste that had clogged her mouth and nostrils. Her near-miraculous return to health did not deliver her from years of racialized derision, the moniker negra de mierda, negress of shit, trailing her like a wraith. Conjured and narrativized, the incident has the texture of an Antonin Artaud poem come to life. The memory of my mother's memory has haunted my more contemplative encounters with the people, playing in the back of my mind as I watched Danny Boyle's Slumdog Millionaire a few years ago. In one of the movie's opening scenes, the young protagonist Jamal escapes from the outhouse in which he had been confined by his brother through the only means available to him, a deep dive into the cesspit underneath. The scene is intended to dramatize and foreground Jamal's iron resolve on display as the movie progresses, and eventually to climax in his material and romantic success. Unsurprisingly, Jamal's dive into excrement has been criticized for exoticizing and trivializing the explosive social history of the fecal as a medium of oppression within the Indian caste system. Yet the scene's visual orchestration of what, in the spirit of Julia Kristeva, we might term the experience of injection, is what first caught my eye and focused my attention. The conventional importance of the excremental as site of debasement and defilement led me to wonder whether there are any cultural scripts for immersion in the fecal that do not privilege repulsion or disgust. There is at least one such script that is now in the ascendant. The negative associations of excrement with disease and impurity have of late been upended by recent research into gastrointestinal microbiomes, as studied through the lens of human waste. In fact, the transplantation of feces for patients suffering from difficult-to-cure bowel ailments, a practice that's evocative of ancient Greco-Roman medicine's trekapoteca, is on the rise as a therapeutic technology. Inspired in part by the biomedical turn in the purposing of excrement then, the Copropolitics that I envision will nod to George Bataille's style solarianality and Mary Douglas-themed discourses of pollution, and Julia Kristeva's analysis of the abject without being enveloped or submerged by them. And the same ambition will hold when it comes to satirical and comical discourses, for which one might plot an arc that begins with Hipponax, or with Aristophanes, or even Homer, as we will see in a moment, and that concludes with Bob Saget's rendition of the Aristocrats joke, which I would encourage you, those of you who have not watched it on YouTube yet, to check out. The morbidly ribald and grotesque, the Bactinian carnivalesque, these are part of the story of excrement, but nowhere close to the whole story. And while no Copropolitics can entirely escape the force field of satire or avoid drift into the purity and pollution matrix, I want to see how far we can range beyond it. Why take the discipline of classics as a springboard? Other disciplines present themselves as more inviting points of departure. In the sciences, public health and epidemiology present themselves as worthy candidates given their track records of handling waste. In the humanities, students of several national literatures, including English literature, have already jump-started the conversation by mining the feco-poetics of Chaucer. And appealingly modeled in a chapter on trash in the city in Rebecca Solnit and Josh Jelly Shapiro's lusciously edited Nonstop Metropolis is a form of new materialism that could also serve as another bootstrap. I tap classics because of the existence of Greek and Roman texts and Greek and Roman social practices that simply and collectively model forms of coexistence and codependence with human and animal waste. And to be quite blunt about it, I want to classicize shit, partly out of a desire to pry open the marbled Winckelmannian stillness and noble grandeur of Greco-Roman classicism, and partly in the hope of feeding the excremental as classical back into discourses that are specific to our contemporary ecological moment. And the Anthropocene is quite a moment, inexorably bound for a dystopia of global environmental calamity in which our inability to control and reduce waste from our prodigious overconsumption has inflicted and will continue to inflict irreversible damage. And among the most exquisitely perverse aspects of the unfolding devastation involves the colossal negative externalities of cow farts, whose contribution to methane emissions is the karmic recompense we have earned for our love of cow flesh. The tragic comedy of being undone by cow farts deserves the 21st century Aristophanes, although I will not be writing that tragic comedy. Further informing and conditioning this talk's rumination on the classicisms of excrement is the desire to root the encounter with classical antiquity in the lower registers of bodily and sensory experience. By lower, I mean not only from the edict perspective of modern receptions of the classical past, with a hierarchization of the classical as high aesthetic and the concomitant sidelining of anything that's deemed low. I also mean from the emid perspective of the ancients themselves, as seen in historical, philosophical, and political scientific attempts to cleave the low bodily functions of defecation and urination from the high functions of the head, speech, cognition, and so on. This disarticulation of the low from the high, undertaken despite and in the face of a counter-discourse that reads the excremental as entwined with the cerebral, since the ancients were no strangers to the principle that tummy health is good for brain health, receives its most spectacular monumental exposition in anatomical topographies of ancient Rome that extend from the head of the capital to the excretory ducts of the cloaca moxen. Here, in brief, is the proposition to be traveled, that tracking the individual and communal experiences at that are structured and defined through Greco-Roman antiquity circuits of excrement production, storage, and management, each process a staging ground for a multiplicity of agencies, from the molecular and the microbiotic to the inter and supra-regional, opens the door to a more vibrantly technicolor vision of the tentacles that stretch out from the ancients to the moderns. The emphasis in what follows will be on tentacular networks, or what those of us inspired to name check Deleuze and Guattari might extol as the rhizomatic. I see the history of excrement, the rhizomatic body par excellence, as a means of testing Dipesh Chakrabarty's thesis that the natural versus human history distinction has become unglued in the Anthropocene. So let's get started with some fun. In the sobering light of the Anthropocene, some of the brute facts of excrement production can take on a rather depressing aspect. The most inconsolably dour distillation of these facts I've come across is David Benato's 2015 essay, The Misanthropic Argument for Antinatalism, in which the realities of human waste production are laid out as justifications for the author's praise of a world with fewer people. Quote, over the course of a lifetime, Benato writes, the average person excretes approximately 50,969 liters of urine and more than 2,467 kilograms of feces. Given the current human population, the annual human production of urine is well in excess of 5 trillion liters. Human bowels currently contribute more than 256 billion kilograms of feces annually. Nor are these the only effluvia, end quote. And he then proceeds to enumerate the heaping quantities of menstrual blood and semen that we generate, as well as figures for the mountains of sanitary products that are moved in order to dispose of effluvial waste. Now, just because I like having fun with numbers, it's not terribly difficult to run some experimental calculations for ancient Greece and Rome that illuminate the scales of ancient waste. Concentrating on the Romans for now, and assuming an average per capita output of 128 grams of feces a day, we would arrive at a figure of 128,000 kilograms of excrement produced daily by early imperial Rome's 1 million inhabitants, and this translates to about 51,392 tons a year. The numbers are but the tip of the dunghill, since they do not include the prodigious quantities of animal dung being excreted in the Rome of the Julian Claudians, and they certainly do not include the numbers that are being produced elsewhere in the Mediterranean. While perhaps not reaching the levels of 1890s London, where 300,000 horses alone produced 1,000 tons of dung a day, the animal depositions of early imperial Rome would not have been far off in this figure in order of magnitude terms. So much of this Roman dung would have circulated through the Cloaca Maxima that structure whose site in 1869 left the novelist Henry James with what he termed, quote, the deepest and grimmest impression of antiquity, end quote, he had ever received. But the volumetric scales of dung moving through Rome are not the only or arguably even the most impressive confirmation of excrement's monumental aspect. I find something strangely moving in all the mentions of Sturgis in the writings of ancient authors, but especially Pliny the Elder's natural history. And in particular, all these recipes that involve human or animal dung that make regular appearances in Book 28 of the Natural History. These recipes form part of the Drecapotheca that has been studied by Heinrich von Staden and has been recently re-examined by Pauline and Pop. To be sure, determining how excrement's volume registers in the rhythms of ancient life and in the imaginaries that emerge around these does require more than just fun with numbers, even though scatologically focused quantification as a prod to higher order thinking has a pedigree that also reaches back into classical antiquity. An arithmetical epigram entitled On the Shit of Augeas, preserved in the Palatine Anthology, takes one of Heracles' labors as an invitation to ruminate on excremental bulk and habit. But what other interpretive projects ramify outward from the measure of masses of dung? For Benator, the metricalization of excrement and its kin has a striving promise not so much a Rem Koolhaas-style fuck context of monumentalizing bigness, but a very specific ethical brief that's hammered home in the closing moments of his essay. Quote, but how many more producers of excrement and urine, flatulence, menstrual blood, semen, sweat, mucus, vomit, and pus do we really need? How much more human waste do we need to process? It would be an aesthetic improvement if there were fewer people. There are, of course, other ways of imagining waste. Not as byproduct that uglifies or as ponderous bloat on the planet or as aesthetically displeasing justification for the elimination of other human beings, but as indispensable mediator of social relations. Seen from the latter perspective, waste functions to generate interpersonal narratives that hold us together. And that far from being wasteful then, waste actually enables social intimacies even when, or precisely when, plotted along the familiar axis of disgrace and humiliation. humiliation. And this story of excrement's viscerally affective resonances, which serves as a cloak and dagger justification for more waste and with it more people, actually begins at the funeral games for Patroclus. Ajax, the big, the great, is on the verge of claiming victory over Athena's doing, on the dung of the oxen that had earlier been sacrificed by Achilles. And Ajax gets to see Odysseus pass him by for the win while he spits out excrement, mouth and nose clogged with shit. This is in book 23 of the Iliad, Anton Optu. One man's triumph is another's humiliation. The Achaeans get a good laugh at Ajax, whose debasement literalizes the fate later to be wished upon Aristophanes Cataphagon. Ajax is the epic prototype of the shit-eater. But the more consequential disclosure of the scene is that animal, human, and divine agencies all slip and slide on the surface of shit. Enabled by fatal violence, the sacrificial oxen which have themselves in fear, their viscera uncontrollably voiding after death, the excremental as a spectacle spreads out into the far corners of the text and into lives that are glossed as sub- or para-epic. The mirth that's occasioned by Ajax's fall and befouling winks back to the communal laughter at Odysseus' manhandling of the upstart Thersites, another tragic comic moment where the merriment is hedged. In a more strictly tragic mode, fecal waste reappears at moments of heart-eating grief in the Iliad. Priam moans and rolls around in shit. Dominos Kapakopon. Wallowed in the muck is one of the more popular English translations of this phrase, at the sight of Hector's corpse being dragged in the dust. While Odysseus in the Odyssey sheds a silent tear at the sight of his beloved dog, who's weakly wagging his tail from a mound of manure. I read all these incidents both as exemplifying a Christavan semiotics of objection, and as communicating a more expansive and, for my money, more illuminating alternative. Excrement as the necessary ingredient in establishing relational and intersubjective dynamics, without which side-splitting laughter or devastating grief cannot take place. It's not so much the case that the onthon or the kopros, as, quote, jettisoned object, is radically excluded and draws us toward the place where meaning collapses, end quote. And here I'm quoting from Gustavus. These scenes unfold precisely as the jettisoned object generates new conditions for social meaning that would otherwise be absent. The fecal's imbrications with the ultimate objection of death are central to the logic of these moments, though Homer does not bring together excrement and death to nearly the same show-stopping effect as the Persian torture of the boats that's reported in Plutarch's Life of Artaxerxes. Homeric excrement is successful instead of providing the fertilizer that's needed for new economies of human relations to take root, as we will see shortly. In any event, post-Homeric efforts to police the fecal reveal an intense anxiety about the affective possibilities that are facilitated by the entwinement of humans with excrement. Plato's Socrates, that sanitizer of sanitizers, who we saw in Paul McCarthy's drawing earlier, has, as it turns out, no patience for cow shit, and he enlists his interlocutors in the Republic to petition Homer and the other poets not to represent heroes in mourning or Priam spinning around in feces. This is Republic 388. Socrates complains that these scenes are ignoble, that they lack in the appropriate ethical uplift. And so here another story begins, or can be said to begin, of the drive to conceal the funk of ordure. The simple strategy is to omit, but the more textually adroit and nimble one is to just write the poop out. Among Virgil's most conspicuous Homeric effects is having the outcome of a race in Book 5 of the Aeneid hinge on another hero slipping, except this time the hero doesn't slip on feces, but on the blood of sacrificed animals. And the substitution of blood for excrement may well have been mediated by a Greek author to which Virgil had access, Sophocles, who cast Ajax into a mess of fluids once again in one of the more wrenching moments of the Ajax, where Tecmessa explains that the now-dead hero had to be covered because he was spurting blood up to his nostrils. This time, his nostrils were not clogged up with shit, they were clogged up with blood instead. If substitution that leaves an elusive trace is one strategy, the drive to expunge completely is another. Many centuries later, Alexander Pope would simply erase the fecal from his translation of the Iliad altogether. These erasures seek to deny the necessity of excrement to human social survival, which brings me to a second feature of the fecal's classical pedigree. Among the many disjunctures between the ancients and the moderns, the 20th and 21st century liberation from natural manure deserves special mention in this context. Building on decades of chemical experimentation, the Haber-Bosch process removed one of the most significant and seemingly ineradicable constraints on agricultural production. Once combined with the application of pesticides, the large-scale production of synthetic fertilizer quadrupled agricultural productivity and set off the population explosion that's responsible for today's global demographics. But prior to Haber-Bosch, hunger for nitrogen-rich manure had dictated imperial ambitions. The guano imperialism of the 1800s being the most dramatic case in point. The guano of history takes on a special resonance in the imaginaries of Emerson, as Eduardo Cara in the back has so movingly demonstrated. As the British and American empires got into the business of sniffing around for new sources of bird food, was the end result of many centuries of agricultural practice and agronomical writing that had identified guano as a valuable form of manure. Value was generated through the commoditization of manure, a practice that had ample precedence in the Greco-Roman Mediterranean. On Hellenistic Delos, for example, we know that the droppings from the pigeons who nested on Apollo's temple were being sold, and that references to the quality of pigeon excrement in Roman agricultural writings gestures to the existence of a fecal economy that was premised on the highly sophisticated differentiation of types of dung according to their properties. By no means was the ancient economy of ordure limited to the collection and sale of bird feces. If there's anything to be taken away from an admittedly confusing notice in Suetonius' Life of Vespasian about attacks on urine, it's that other forms of bodily effluvia were capable of being monetized too. How do you think this tax on urine worked? But excrement's preeminence in the commodity circuits of waste is apparent well before the advent of monetized currency unlocks new possibilities for transaction, as Homer again discloses. We know from the Odyssey that the dog Argos breathes his last on mule and cow manure that has been piled up before the gates of Odysseus' house for servants to take away and use as manure on the family farms, called Place Homes. Is that manure the dirt in Laertes' hands when Odysseus comes across him tending to his vineyard in Odyssey Book 24? If Ajax with his clawed nostrils is the ancestor of the old comic shit-eater, Laertes the gardener might have an equally compelling claim to being the epic forebearer of Theophrastus' manure-savvy botany, routed to separate but not radically disparate ends, both in Virgilian poetry and in Plinian encyclopedias several centuries later. Whatever the precise makeup of Laertes' dirt, for us moderns, Homeric manuring is one more cultural complex on the other side of the ancient modern divide, thanks to the transformative prowess of Haber-Bosch. The ready availability of industrially produced manure, ostensibly, and I emphasize ostensibly, sets 20th and 21st century agribusiness apart from the agrarian rhythms of the pre- and early modern world, where the caretaking and redistribution of excrement was quite literally a matter of life and death. For modern societies in which these rhythms still prevail, or have been reintroduced, the old manuring questions persist. How and when to collect, how and when to spread, how and when to secure and apply the most nutrient-rich kinds. But there is no dialing the clock back to a fully pre-industrial dynamic, since nowadays factory waste makes its way even into non-artificial manure. And in any event, positing a dramatic disjuncture runs the usual risk of oversimplification. As Haber-Bosch is a technology, so too was ancient soil and manure science, grounded in experimentation, verification, and imperially facilitated translation and co-optation. Nonetheless, the swapping out of old manure systems for new circuits of chemical engineering did entail the displacement of embodied and rigorously localized knowledge. Nowadays, the option of applying miracle grow to a recalcitrant plot of land folds another option into itself, the transcending of the local. And here again we might be tempted to plot a disjunction between antiquity and 21st century modernity, with the ancient scrupulous attention to the contingencies of soil and the paired imperatives of field rotation and soil replenishment, giving way to the modern monoculture regimes whose intensification has been facilitated by industrial manure and whose success is registered in innocent seeming generalized implications of different regional breadbaskets. Monoculture was not alien to the Greeks or Romans, of course, but in scale and in ecological devastation, the moderns of the global north stand apart. And what has helped us stand apart is the chemically engineered fertilizer whose production and distribution are profoundly implicated in the slow violence of ecological catastrophe. Claims to land are at the center of Rob Nixon's work on this, but land and sea alike have undergone alteration on account of the application of industrial fertilizer. Eutrophication of fresh water sources and the oxygen depletion of sizable swaths of oceanic coastline are being triggered in part by fertilizer runoff, and there is more devastation in store. If we were in the business of neat histories, we might describe the trajectory of manure as extending from its non-synthetic origins as a constitutive feature of pre-modern agricultures to a synthesized and scalable instrument for feeding the mouths of billions, an instrument whose continued deployment now menaces the well-being of our Earth. But I want to revisit the signifying possibilities of manure. This time is detectable not only in Homeric economies of laughter and grief, but in the archaeological documentation for ancient manuring itself. The key here will be to resituate manure as hermeneutically productive. When the intensive surveys of the 1970s and 1980s brought to light the pattern of artifact halos that radiated outward from most ancient Greek sites, John Bintliff and Anthony Snodgrass drew on ethnographic and comparative archaeological research to propose their manuring hypothesis, according to which these halos of fragmented pottery were the direct consequence of manure spreading out over cultivated landscapes after collections in mounds and pits. Long ago disintegrated and reabsorbed into the soil, the manure was no more, but its traces in the form of the broken pottery and assorted other rubbish that had been chopped into the manure before its application were not only tangible, but quantifiable. With this insight, manure, the substance, was repositioned as a medium with a message about the ceramics whose dense overlay over the classical Greek landscape had previously demanded explanation, yes, but also about the networks of individual and communal labor, human-animal-plant collaboration and symbiosis, and artisanal and technological innovation that had inscribed these halos into the landscape, and about the demographic pulsations and contractions of these networks, now ripe for reconstruction by the archaeologist and data-driven cultural historian. Conjured up through the study of ceramic scatters, manure mounds and dung piles can be made to speak volumes about local patterns and super-regional structures, the microhistorical and the très bon trouvé. And the reconstruction of these networks has been supplemented with an archaeozoological and genetic analysis of recovered coprolites and dung pits to yield additional information about dietary, parasite, and land management histories. For all that this explosion of knowledge outward from the realia of the fecal has facilitated the reconceiving of waste's hermeneutic and historiographic possibilities, I'm not sure that holding forth in this vein will communicate with force and clarity why exactly a Copropolitics grounded in Greco-Roman antiquity has sunk to off the 21st century, although we could talk about manuring all night. In pursuit of some possible justifications, let me turn now to the Roman world's poetics of ordure, and then work my way back to some Greeks in the process. In Roman Italy, preoccupation with dung matters not only predates the earliest attested Latin poetry, but also leaks into the earliest poetry to survive more or less intact, Claude-kind drama. In the case of the former, a Latin language inscription from South Italy set up some years after the foundation of a colony at Apulia, Lucaria, around 300 BCE, preserves a set of regulations for a sacred grove. Quote, into this grove let no one pour dung or toss a corpse or offer ritual to the deceased. In foregrounding the importance of policing and legislating excrement, the constitution of urban and to urban space, or in this particular instance, the delimitation of a natural grove within the urban. The inscription is not the only one of its kind. Some 2 centuries later, an edict of the praetor Lucius Sentius, marking off an area of Rome's Campus Esquilinus, and instructing residents not to make a cremation place or toss dung or a corpse on the site closest to the city, would be carved and installed in a travertine slab. The primary reason for these efforts to regulate the deposition of feces and of the dead, a nice trick of ontological leveling, is obvious enough. These factors of pollution, not to say of disease, had to be routed out of the city. Signs of this outward momentum came to be inscribed into the Roman city's spatial organization, not only through epigraphic reminders and through investments in sewage infrastructure, but through the calendar's organization of civic time, courtesy of the abbreviation QSDF that appears on several extant calendars. Quando storcum talatum fas. It is fas, appropriate to conduct everyday ritual and political actions once the poop has been taken out. As the human body does, so too does the Roman city organize itself around regular expulsions of death and waste, continuing, and in some respects scaling up, the intestinal movements of the classical and Hellenistic Greek city. If Heraclides Ponticus hit the mark in branding Rome a Greek polis, it should come as no surprise that the poop preoccupations of the Greek polis made inroads at Rome, not least in that one field where Romans swiftly proved themselves exceptionally keen students of the Greeks. Plautus's comedies, the great poetic enterprise taking flight during the Second Punic War and its aftermath, which together with the emergence of Roman historiography mark a turning point in Roman efforts to take over and transform aspects of Greek culture, track the systole and diastole of excrement as an object of public concern. Roman comedy's elusively slippery play with the fecal would bring a smile to any audience member who had already been familiar with Greek Old or New comedy. The scholar Michael Fontaine has detected the ironic answer Mordicus, shitty, behind Grypus' answer to a pimp's slightly obscure riddle in one of Plautus' plays, The Broodings. After all, according to the logic of the joke, this pimp is just another fishy pimp who eats a whole lot of shit. But one moment of straight-up scatological invective is remarkable for its centering of excrement as an entity in public space. In the Persa, Toxilus goes on a tirade that features the choice insult, "You scum-mixed public shit heap." It's the concentration on excrement as a site of public attention, note this invective, we never called someone a public shit heap, that I want to tease out from the satiric and comedic mainstream of poop jokes before and after Plautus, and 2 points in this connection need to be fleshed out more. The first is that we shouldn't recode the Copropolitics of ancient waste removal as anticipating essential priority of modern cities, namely sewage management and disposal as strategies for the maintenance of public hygiene and as spurs to the articulation of a public or private discourse about the manners and proper public behavior. That's not to say that I wouldn't contend that Greeks and Romans have no interest in public hygiene or manners. They do, and the status demarcating implications of that concern will come to light in a moment. But Greco-Roman management of excrement operated within other networks, among those the networks that brought manure to the farms that provisioned cities. And here we look back to the halo effect that I mentioned in connection with free manuring earlier. Waste had a life after its expulsion from clusters of urban habitation. And that afterlife, so indispensable to the feeding of mouths, to the continuation of human life, ennobles manure and makes it even deserving of a sacred etiology in some circles. The introduction of manuring in Italy was credited to a semi-divine Stercutus, worshipped by some Romans as a god. The sacralization of waste brings me to my second point, which has to do with the ritualization of excrement. Greek interlacings of ritual and feces are dimly discernible already in archaic Greek poetry. A puzzling fragment of Hipponax seems to depict a rite involving a Lydian woman and some spattering with shit, parapsipstatson, orbito, accompanied by a profusion of dung beetles. But Roman material has arguably more to offer on this score. In mimicking an inscriptional ban on dumping, the imperial satirist Persius taps the rare word oleito. This word was apparently of interest to a grammarian, an authority behind a rather gnomic sentence that's quoted in a lexicographical work, Festus's Lexicon. And the sentence quoted from this grammarian is simply this: the priestess took a dump in Mars' shrine, sacerdotula and sacrario martelli fecit oletum. Curiously enough, this sentence, this odd sentence, is of sufficient interest to a Benedictine monk, Paul the Deacon, who makes the cut in his epitome of Festus's work several centuries later. There is one question to which we might want some answers, which is why an entry devoted to this obscure word stood out in a dictionary enough to be copied over and preserved. We don't know the shrine of Mars in which this priestess took her dump, but the possibility of a priestess relieving herself in pagan sacred space may have titillated Paul the Deity. He might have come across Elatum in a dusty inscription, or associated the word with a scrap or two of imperial Latin poetry, such as that verse from Perseus that you see on your slide. But one doesn't have to wander too far in the bramble and brush of the Thesaurus Linguae Latinae to find other potential justifications for a continuing engagement with this word across space and time. Oletum is kin of the verb oleto, to defile, which makes a memorable appearance in Ambrose's partial transcript of the proceedings of the Council of Aquileia in 381 CE. Delivering judgment on Palladius' Arian leanings, the bishop Lamenius declares that Palladius, quote, had befouled himself with perfidy, zeolatavid perfidia. Christian heresiology would mobilize many tropes, the excremental among them, and cognate with this term to scat talk was the penchant in Christian homiletic circles, Greek and Latin, within that same period, for conjuring up electrifyingly repulsive images of the fecal. As Blake Layerly demonstrated in 2009, the language of filth is right in there in John Chrysostom's homilies as part of a concerted rhetorical effort to downgrade the ostentatious behaviors of the powerful high, and I quote her directly. For present purposes, it will suffice to underline the function of the excremental in this context as a node that links together several kinds of speech and genres of literary performance: the legislative epigraphic, the satirical comedic, the grammatical lexicographic. Notable, too, in the case of the lemma that's referred to in the dictionary, is the sacerdotala's violation of a prohibition against defecation, one of those prohibitions likely to have been more honored to the British. At this point, though, we should subject this sacro-excremental discourse to two additional questions. First, what if you really have to go? And second, who is responsible for removing the waste that happens to be deposited in the wrong location? The Roman relief from Aquileia, that you see here, in which Jupiter brandishes his thunderbolt at the poor soul who had the misfortune of shitting in the wrong place, is kind of funny. The Pompeian graffiti that admonished passers-by to get a move on and take their dumping somewhere else tickle the funny bone too. But to do full justice to the forms of privilege and oppression that cluster around waste relief will entail pushing past the diagnostics of humor given the range of strategies, ancient and modern, for plotting waste disposal and management along status, class, and gender lines. The regulatory and infrastructural regimes through which human and animal waste were shuttled out of the ancient city have modern scholarly imaginations dancing between visions of idealizing cleanliness and nightmares of feces and crusted slums. What requires even more of an imaginative feat, though, is inhabiting, if only for the most fleeting moment, the subjectivities of antiquity's excrement handlers and night soilmen, the Andres Copropolitics summoned by one of the slaves who's kneading a dung cake in Aristophanes' pots, or of today's manure scavengers, not to say the subjectivities of those who are forced to hold their waste in by laws that police the privy with discriminatory intent. Those networks I referenced earlier through which waste circulates link not only people of unequal statuses, but entrench distinction through the routing of that circulation. Varro in the Res Rusticae coolly comments that some people, Guidon, place slave toilets right above the animal manure collections. How many slaves fell into cesspits? Then, as well as now, there was bathroom art to lighten the load. The feelings of vulnerability, anxiety, and fear that orbit the fecal are lampooned in the paintings of the Austrian Tavern of the Seven Sages, whose decorative program has been read by J.R. Clarke as, quote, making fun of elite intellectual pretensions. Above the sage depicted on the left side of the south wall, we have the caption, Ut bene cacaret ventrum palpavit solon. Solon rubbed his tummy that he might shit better. Duorum cacantes monuit mutant thales, reads a caption on the right side. Thales admonished, cautioned those who were shitting hard to keep trying. The facial expression of those straining hard had something to offer the wisecrackers too. And what is unmistakably a constipation joke, Marshall advises a friend to consume more lettuce, quote, because you have the hard face of someone shitting, end quote. In Marshall's own lifetime, no less an eminence than the first of the imperial Flavians, have been teased for having a constipated face. Chuckle, chuckle. But it's not all humor in this context all the time either. In the centuries of Rome's imperial zenith, anxieties about the proper circulation of fecal matter would be documented in Artemidorus' analysis of dreamscapes, the Oneirocritica, known to some of you because Foucault decided to write a book to analyze it. The Oneirocritica reports a positive outcome for those who dream of defecating in riverine or marshland environments, since such dreams signify that the defecator would, quote, unload his cargo without shame, end quote. The translation of excrement into cargo locks into that commoditization of waste whose parameters we sketched earlier. At the same time, the transfiguration of excrement into dream stuff opens another door to the study of waste. One more in step with the Lacanian and Foucauldian project of recovering the self that is constituted through act of excretion. Numerous dreams cataloged by Artemidorus and by his Oneirocritical successors in late antiquity involve excrement. How many of you has dreamt of defecating on a rich friend? Artemidorus knows someone who has dreamt of shitting on a rich friend. Quote, this man received his friend's property and became his heir. And conversely, a certain person imagined that he was defecated upon by a poor man. And he was harmed terribly by that person and suffered great shame. Fecal anxieties do not fade in the twilight of the late empire if the Oneirocriticon that is credited to the Patriarch Constantinople is any indication, quote, if you sit in feces in your dream, you will experience all manner of harm, end quote. An interpretation echoed in another Oneirocriticon that's ascribed to the legendary Astrampsicus. Even seeing or approaching dung in a dream could signify, quote, quarrels or shame and sorrows, end quote, according to the Oneirocriticon. That excrement is implicated in the cyclically tense process through which we constitute our horizons as subjects, in contradistinction to objects, was not lost on our friend Lacan, with whose lectures on anxiety I led off this paper. Lacan devotes a unit of these lectures, from anal to ideal, to a critique of potty training and its repercussions, and I'd like to query a selection from that chapter now, and I quote him, as you see quoted on your slide. By what path does excrement enter subjectification? Well, it enters by the intermediary of the other's demand, represented on this occasion by the mother. This is altogether clear in the analytic references, or at least seems so on first approach. When we figure that out, we're quite content. We fall in line with the observational data, the educational data, of what's called potty training, which instructs the child to hold in. The child is asked to hold in. He's made to hold in too long, to start to introduce excrement into the realm of what belongs to his body, and he starts to make it a part of his body, which is considered, at least for a while, as something not to belong. Then, after that, he is told to let it out, again on demand. Not only does the other approve and pay attention, but it tacks on all these additional dimensions I needn't mention. In other realms, this makes for funny physics, the sniffing, the approval, even the wiping, whose erogenous effects everyone knows to be incontestable. At the anal level, he has the first opportunity of recognizing himself in an object. The little pile of shit in question is obtained on demand and is admired. What a fine poo! But the second phase of this demand implies that it is, as it were, forsworn. Because all the same, the child is taught not to get too close to this fine poo. In this first relation with the other's demand, we thus find ourselves at the level of an ambiguous recognition. What is there is both him and not him. And even further, it doesn't come from him. I'll divide over for now the question of whether this analysis holds true for cultures that do not elaborate and concretize potty training leadership. It seems to me that the generalizable point, irrespective of sociocultural and historical contingencies, is that excrement is from the earliest moments of its apprehension as such a site for the production of self-regimentation that shuttles between two poles, proximity and estrangement. It is in the space between these poles that the other attains viability and visibility in consciousness, as I mentioned at the outset. The other that is dear, the one who grants or withholds approval according to the felicity of the dump, as well as the other that is held at a distance, the dump that is taught to the child as an occasion for congratulation, but that is also taught to the child as an occasion for restraint. Becoming aware of one's dumping is, as it were, the first exercise in taxonomy. But for all that attending to excrement's eruption into the subconscious offers those of us seeking more effectively to vectorize imaginaries of excrement, I would argue that the most rewarding payoff to this venture in Copropolitics comes in leveraging excrement for the production of new aesthetics. And it's here that I want to linger by way of conclusion. When Derek Walcott, as Omeros' narrator, contemplate, quote, all that Greek manure under the green bananas, under the indigo hills, the rain-rutted road, the galvanized village, the myth of rustic manners, glazed by the transparent page of what I've read, quote. It's tempting and no doubt justified to interpret this manure as metaphorical, as emblematic of the ambivalence that's experienced in recoursing to the classical legacy, as Helen Morales has suggested. This legacy, quote, is both muck and fertilizer, both pollution and inspiration, end quote. And Edith Hall has tapped the electricity of this metaphor for post-colonial receptions of the Greco-Roman legacy. But we might take a step further in light of my comments about guano imperialism and accentuate how the fecal has historically been implicated in projects of colonial domination. But I want to be more literal-minded in reading the entwinements of fecality and poetry. An epigram of the 1st century BC Greek poet Erychius documents an accusation leveled at a Parthenius, possibly the Parthenius of Nicaea, who exerted considerable influence on Latin esoteric poets. He, reads the accusation, stepped to such a level of madness as to declare the Odyssey muck and the Iliad dung. With these lines, Lindsay Watson sought to unlock the discursive poetic techniques through which the Roman poet Catullus, in infamously disparaging the annales of his contemporary Volusius as beshattered sheets, kakata karta, recycles and expands upon Callimachus' description of the muddy Euphrates dragging along garbage and excrement. I'm not terribly interested in whatever Catullus may have had in mind with his kakata karta, or with the dynamics of scat invective directed at fellow authors that resurfaced in Marshall's later denigration of one of his own imperial contemporaries as writing the kind of poetry that people read in bathrooms while shitting. Rather, my concern is with working through the proposition that poetic production in general ought to be figured as excremental. Analogies of poetry to excrement invite us to embrace the possibility that poetry as a species of artistic production is worth as much as shit, which is to say, a great deal. What exactly did Artaud mean in 1945 when, in a letter to a friend, he complained that, quote, this century no longer understands fecal poetry? The sentences that unspool from this claim don't afford much illumination, but I'll read them out anyway because they're fun. Quote, the intestine malady of herself, Madame Death, since the age of ages, has been sounding the depths of her dead woman's column, her dead woman's anal column, in the excrement of an abolished survival, the corpse too of her abolished cells, and who for the crime of not having been able to exist, for never having been able to exist, for never having been able to be a creature, had to fall, the better to sound the depths of her own being into this abyss of foul matter, and indeed so pleasantly foul, in which the corpse of Madame Death, Madame Fecal Uterine, Madame Anus, hell upon hell of excrement, and the opium of her excrement, foments hunger, the fecal destiny of her soul, in the uterus of her own center. After puzzling over this passage for quite some time, I still don't really understand what's going on, but the collocation woman column anus corpse uterus in Artaud's vision activates and mobilizes an associative complex with quite the ancient pedigree, and one better studied under the lens of the history of science, a field in which the actor and director who embraced the medical as opposed to historical perspective on culture soon found himself at home. It's not as surprising that Artaud's interest in the excremental caught the attention of Kristeva, since he had a knack for diagnosing the humorous of objection, and Kristeva ran with it. Prompted by Parthenius and Catullus, though, I want to push beyond Kristeva and propose that what has been forgotten or suppressed is the anxiety that aesthetic performance and experience hold the very same relation to us as the excremental does. Even to articulate this association of fecality and aesthetics in relational terms is to soft-pedal matters somehow. Art, on this reading, is excremental. And even if this is not a two-way street, most excrement not rising to the status of art, the core of the message that's concentrated in Piero Manzoni's cant or the Guggenheim installation is that art is shit inasmuch as it is simultaneously utterly wasteful and absolutely necessary for our constitution as subjects. Where the tendency might be to read the equation of art, shit, as disparaging of art, or of some of its practitioners, as transgressive in its defiance of the conventional scripting of art, is far above shame. I would propose a recalibration. Art's rendering as excrement pays a compliment to a foundational uncertainty that is stitched into the aesthetic experience. In order to make a more emphatic case for the celebratory aesthetics of the people, though, we would need to readjust our priming with regards to waste, an undertaking that will require of us a willingness to set aside modes of negotiating the excremental that privilege dissociation or repudiation in favor of a mode that endorses reconciliation and proximity. There is no denying that in ancient Greece and Rome, scatological humor circulates as political statements. Geopolitical matters changed dramatically in the centuries between the staging of Aristophanes' Pox, which features a voracious dung beetle being flown up to the heavens, and Seneca the Younger's mockeries of the deified Emperor Claudius. The Copropolitics of the democratic polis were one thing, and those of the empire might another. To represent the bumbling Claudius as exclaiming, "Why may puto con cacao me, woe is me, I think I shat myself," on his deathbed, and to characterize his last words as fully in keeping with a person who had defecated on everything else, omnia curte con cacao, prior to ascending to the heavens and being confronted with the realization that he was no longer the supreme cock on his own dunghill, was edgy, to put it mildly. If Seneca clothed his copropolitical chastisement of the Emperor Claudius in the medley of satire, it fell to his nephew Lucan to express derision for Nero with the tools of his body. If the biographical traditions report his bowel movements and thunder farts in the face of the Nero power can be trusted. Fast forward a few centuries, and a golden-mouthed Christian bishop would fling around scat talk in his homilies, this time with a view to upbraiding Christians and non-Christians alike for their predilection for luxury, getting his congregation to think about excrement was John Chrysostom's means of thundering for social and cultural change. The political and excremental continue to retain a special affinity for each other. Some years ago, Dan Savage's flash of Aristophanic genius decisively altered Rick Santorum's digital profile. Hensky's certification of the then Republican and now current presidential figure at the top of U.S. politics has been paralleled since the inauguration in scores of protest speech, all latching on in their own unique way to the dump Trump anthem. Last spring, West Virginia Governor Jim Justice exhibited a plate of bovine excrement in response to his state legislature's inability to come up with an acceptable budget. And over the Christmas holidays, a psychologist employed by the Los Angeles Department of Mental Health posted a gift-wrapped box of horse manure to U.S. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, terming it an act of political theater and justifying the selection of manure by reference to a now infamous U.S. Supreme Court decision. Quote, "A few years ago, when the Citizens United ruling said that corporations are persons and money equals free speech, that is so absurd, and my rule of thumb is now that if corporations are free speech, then so is horseshit," end quote. It's easy to read, digest, and discard these episodes in the life of excrement as scat humor, since to a large degree, they are scat humor. But the weightier issue here, once again, concerns the conceptual and hermeneutic pliability of excrement, and the meaning of that pliability for our framing of excrement social relationalities. Since Greco-Roman antiquity, we have used excrement to talk to each other, nesting the fecal into the political, and performing art with the fecal. But now there is a new and pressing politics around which excremental considerations cluster, and that is the politics of the microbiome to which I alluded earlier. The expansion of our knowledge about microbiomes, particularly the gastrointestinal ones, is raising not just political but ethical and epistemological questions. Whether and how to fold microbial residues into the existing architecture of personal identification and surveillance. How to reevaluate narratives of agency and responsibility for personnel health that are still reeling from the collision with genetics and epigenetics. At the heart of so much of the research and its application is nothing other than excrement. Not only a site and object of study, but as primary medium for the conveyance of good gut microbes between the gastrically healthy and the gastrically ill. We may soon find ourselves talking more about gastric privilege. And perhaps in the long run, we may find ourselves not only at a scientific crossroads, but even at a theological one, when the prospect of worshiping excrement in the manner of those Romans honoring Striculus among their gods moves from the funny to the earnest. We can join Gene Logsdon, who was bowled over by Walt Whitman's ode to the compost that quote, grows such sweet things out of corruptions, end quote, in into seeking the divine materials in the norm. Or we could channel the spirit of Virgil, who when asked why he was reading the early Latin poet Ennius, was said to have answered that he was seeking gold in dung. We haven't forgotten the meaning of fecal poetry. In a 21st century moment so crammed with experimental inventiveness, classicists could not have hoped for a better dice roll. It's time, I think, to reset our antiquities fecal poetry once again under the sign of a Copropolitics that is equal parts academic discipline and artistic mode. Literary criticism's preoccupation with ethics and literature anchored to the Nussbaum notion that literature affords dynamic space for ethical reflection has inspired a return to the ethics in history that for centuries conditioned and structured historiographic practice. With a classicizing Copropolitics, one could pull off the same feats by taking the long durée of the fecal and our social contortions around it as a device for more exacting scrutiny of the blame and shame hierarchies through which we order our communities and our aesthetics. Thank you very much. So, anyone want to talk about food?
Anybody to talk about food?
Oh!
No?
It's a very fertile area of investigation.
Comments, questions?
Ooh. Yeah, the back.
There is an artist who's working with fecal transplants, Kathy High. Do you know her?
Oh, no!
And also, she used this expression, which I think beats your title. It's called gut love. So she was, yeah. But it's all mediated by medical imagery and what you referred to in the beginning, the molecular. So, and also all this has to do with what they talk about. Basically, all these ideas about waste and the fecal as a new commodity. So I was wondering, is this a kind of invasion of this moment into the classical? And if you read a book by Nicolas Bourriaud, The X Form, Bourriaud goes back to Bataille and the excrement, but then he says it's unthinkable to talk about the classical moment, Plato, politics, in terms of the excrement, because it's the ideal, the word of the ideal. So how does this sort of, your kind of narrative, which has to do a lot with the present moment, kind of fits in with this older narrative about, the classical as a kind of world which converses with the ideal, especially as regards the political, and perhaps Plato, politics, the Republic, and all that.
Oh, thank you so much. So you've now given me one thing to look at and one thing to read. So for that I am grateful. So one way I would sort of develop the rough pattern of an answer in my head is to think about the classical as a technology for suppressing the fecal, right? So this is why that passage in the Republic is so resonant for me, because in the course of this exchange, it becomes clear on Socrates' view that one of the strategies for ensuring that poetry is properly responsive to the ethical imperatives that he thinks it should abide by is by eliminating all of these moments that he cascades in conversation as disgraceful. And among them are the scene of Brian rolling around in shit, which he cites explicitly. Now, this effort at suppressing the fecal is, like all pseudo-totalitarian projects, which is what the Republic ultimately embarks on, doomed to fail. It requires this act of mystification that presumes that the ideal is forever and always a sphere that does not handle the lower bodily registers, even as it becomes clear that you can't help but talk about the lower bodily registers, right? You have to engage in this sort of practice of education in which you teach people over and over again to engage in this species of suppression. And part of that work, at least in the perspective of that conversational strand that occurs in the Republic, involves making sure that the texts to which they are exposed do not have these moments. But of course, that removal of those texts doesn't mean that they're not going to be shitty. Right? So like, this is where the suppressive mechanism begins to totter. But I think there's another aspect to this that's also worth bringing out, and this goes now to the sort of the broader premises of your question. So I think part of but as I see it, one of the tasks of this project is to underline that the fecal has always been with us. And not just in the sense that we all poop, but in the sense that so much of the stylings of the classical that recognizes and authorizes itself as classical because of this appeal to the suppressive mechanism I referenced earlier, proves ultimately incapable of dissociating and decoupling itself from the instrumental. And there are some historical parameters to that I tried to sketch, right? I mean, poop is quite literally ubiquitous, and sensory archaeologists and historians have tried to do some work recently thinking about just how all-pervasive, the smells of poop and urine are in ancient Rome, although people readjust their sensory expectations pretty quickly in those environments. But more important for me than simply arriving at a sort of strictly or purely positivistic account of how poop enters into the day-to-day rhythms of these poets from classical antiquity and these historians and political theorists from classical antiquity that I mine, is thinking about how the excremental proves incapable of being suppressed at the register of art, right? So one way in which it's obviously always present is in the invective, because the invective strategies that emerge in these different generic contexts heavily privilege the excremental as a species of denigration. But of course, this opens up its own kind of trap for those people who are participating in the project of using the excremental as a mechanism for invective, which is that poop has all of these therapeutic usages that are well known to the ancients themselves, or that they think they know how to handle. I mean, there's an open question as to whether many of these treatments that are outlined in, say, Book 28 of Pliny the Elder's Natural History are actually efficacious treatments, or simply involve people ingesting things that are just bad for them, right? Like the ashes of horse dung that Nero is said to have consumed almost every day. So there is linked to this a history of medicine argument that I think is as significant as the sort of history of aesthetic practice that I'm interested in recovering. But in all, I think the cumulative effect is to deny the possibility that there is, in fact, this clean-cut divide between the discursivities that surround the excremental in antiquity, however configured or mapped, and the discursivities that surround and calibrate the excremental in the here and now. That's not to say that I would posit a continuous story, because I think there are many discontinuities, but it is to say that it would, for me, be simply another act of mystification to assume that the classical is only or primarily conversant with the ideal. Right? So that would be my answer.
Thank you.
Yes?
Thank you for your nice speech. Actually, I didn't expect a subject like that.
Surprise.
All right. So, could you please answer to this simple question that I have? What's the correlation between Copropolitics and politics itself?
So,
is there any connection, actually?
Yeah, no, I think that there is quite a connection. Well, to make the point. So, I've been struck lately by efforts on the part of certain, how should I designate it? Should I say that they're conservative or conservatizing political actors to insist on a mode of political discourse that is elevated, right? So the way this works, particularly not only in American context, I mean, I think it's in fact a ubiquitous discursive phenomenon. It's to say, we are the ones who practice politics as it should be done. We don't use bad words, we don't curse at each other, we certainly don't throw insults at each other. And then there are these others who have different rules. But that's bad, because they use these insults and they use this degrading language and all that. I think one of the real tensions that has emerged on the political scene globally in recent years concerns the kinds of vocabularies that are deemed appropriate as opposed to inappropriate to political activity. And so on this reading, and along the lines of the argument that I'm plotting in the paper, the Copropolitical is a subspecies of the political that would really try to hammer home like what it means to think with and do the work of being extramental, of having shit talk. And so some of these images of the protests that have taken place over the past almost 2 years have I think brought the point out quite elegantly. Although of course there are ways of weaponizing the extramental that have less value. There are some ways that have more value than others. So, do I think that bringing in a piece of poop to a legislative meeting in order to convey your disdain for the budget failure is like an efficacious speech act? I don't know. Like I guess it sort of conveys one's disgust, right? Do I think that posting a member of the cabinet a box of horse manure is an efficacious speech act? Again, it's definitely funny, but here I think a lot rides on the significance of this quotation that I take from an interview that Robert Strong did. Is it the case that when we talk about the extramental, we can move beyond simply using it as a weaponizing tool, as a species of invective discourse, and use it instead to think about, well, what is free speech? What is speech, in this account? And Strong here takes real issue with this Supreme Court decision that had classed corporations as people, as individuals, for the purposes of free speech protections, and says, well, poop is free speech too. This is as part of the personhood debate as corporations should be. But again, this is very satirical, right? And it clearly has an invective slant. What would be more purposeful, and I think more generative in my view, is to think about the many political capacities of excrement that don't lie primarily or even revolve around the satirical. And so that's what I mean by the Copropolitical as distinct from the political in itself as a sort of genus or class.
So we consider this topic on level of language.
So definitely at the level of language, and definitely at the level of artistic practice, which is also to do like
But you can see it from another point of view, like trying to find some good, some pleasant
right.
in a way.
Yes.
Because something anyway, so we're always trying to hide it. And I think there is some kind of relation between politics and politics, certainly, to read this way.
And that's so I did not want to sort of go well over the self-imposed maximum verbiage for tonight. But if I had 10 or 15 more minutes, I would have talked about this painting by the artist Kara Walker. So Kara Walker is very interested in ripping away the veils that we use in order not to talk about things that are unpleasant, right? And she has over the years produced these paintings that I think are quite marvelous in attending to those aspects of the American legacy in which the fecal plays a very prominent part as something that is tied up with the inherent unpleasantness and brutality of enslavement in some cases. And so you have these paintings, and this is the Epilocal Tom and the Grand Allegorical Tableau of Eva in Heaven at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, in which you do see people pooping, right? But of course that's not the only signifier of the nastiness, right? The real nastiness, of course, are these signifiers of, say, masters raping enslaved women, killing their children, and things like that. And so you have coordinated in these visual works by Kara Walker an effort to show how the fecal works within a matrix of signifying possibilities that all are being veiled by these strategies that we've negotiated in order to avoid talking about unpleasant things, right? And so that too, I think, plays a very, very important role in this story. Yes?
Just a parallel remark, as a matter of fact. Just very interesting. It reminded me just of my reading quite a few years ago about China. It's another country. And a book named Function by William Hinton. And the book is about this Hinton being on the spot in a Chinese village during the revolution of 1945 thereabouts. And one of the most interesting customs within that village, and I presume within this area, at least in China at the time, was the great social and moral even positive value of city viewing. Because if somebody visited you in your house and relieved himself of a certain cliche, this was considered a great honor, because this started to become the manure which was necessary for you to cultivate. Which is interesting parallel about good and bad uses of
No, this is that too is now a resource to consult. But yes, I mean there are these cultures throughout the world and throughout the historic time, which in fact it was a means of bestowing honor on the head of household to defecate in the house, right? And so this introduces, I think, another set of possibilities. And this is also why I hedged my reading of Lacan, because I mean Lacan elaborates this. What is, I think, still like an impressively evocative account of potty training and physicality that is completely untethered to sociocultural variation and contingency, right? And so to think about Far Eastern cultures, or to think about even cultures in the Indian subcontinent, where the act of relieving oneself is a means of bringing honor and satisfaction to the people in whose house you're staying, is, I think, the next step in this line of work, right? It would enable the prospect of a global copropolitics to come into more clearer view.
Diachronic also.
Diachronic and global copropolitics. It'll be great. It'll be great. Yes.
Thank you very much for an excellent talk. Talking about copropolitics from a different angle, actually. Viral movements are controlled by the autonomic nervous system, so subjects, personalities are related to constipation. So by interviewing politicians, probably we have to interview them in terms of constipation or not.
Like the Romans.
Like the Romans. Whenever I reflect on this passage, I referenced the Suetonius' life of Vespasian, in which Vespasian is described as having the face of one who is trying to poop. The verb there normally means trying, but it means specifically trying to poop. I dwell on the sort of closing portion of this passage. So it appears that Vespasian, like many of the emperors, at some early stage in his reign, when he was overseeing court decisions, was challenged by one of the litigants in the case. And apparently things started to get a little heated, and Vespasian, said, as the presiding judge, something rude, told him to sort of wait for the decision that was coming. And so the litigant responded, I'll wait for it to come once you're done relieving yourself, right? I mean, like in a very sort of explicit effort at actualizing something that everyone was saying behind his back, which was that, oh my God, he's constipated. But no, nowadays I look at all these interviews with politicians, and I often find myself wondering, are they holding it in?
Shall we go up? Yes. For a drink? Continue the discussion?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
This is on the 12th, right? Yeah, I'll come.
Yeah, that's true.
So I'll come back.